I didn't set out looking for hidden or suppressed technology when I began researching transportation in the 19th century. At the time, I was chasing a much simpler question. If New York City was already overwhelmed with traffic by the 1860s, why didn't it build a subway until 1904? London had already opened the world's first underground railway in 1863. New York had the money. It had engineers. It had a massive population and streets that were already breaking under the strain. Everything suggested the city should have built one much earlier. So why did it wait 40 years? That question led me somewhere unexpected. During my research, I came across photographs from 1870. Not sketches or theoretical proposals tucked away in dusty archives. Real photographs. And what they showed was astonishing. They showed an underground railway already operating beneath Broadway. The images revealed a waiting room beneath the streets of Manhattan, decorated with chandeliers and frescoed walls. There was a fountain filled with goldfish. A grand piano stood in the corner. Plush seating lined the walls. It looked less like a transportation station and more like the lobby of a luxury hotel. And running through the tunnel was something even stranger. A cylindrical passenger car gliding silently through the underground passage. There was no smoke, no steam, no horses pulling it. The train moved using nothing but compressed air. Passengers described it as smooth and quiet, almost like floating. Air pressure pushed the car forward through the tunnel, and suction pulled it back the other way. Beneath the chaos of Manhattan's streets, people were traveling comfortably through a clean underground tube. In its first year alone, around 400,000 people rode it. And then it disappeared. Not slowly. Not because a better system replaced it. It simply stopped. The tunnel was sealed off with brick. The passenger car remained underground, untouched for more than 4 decades. In 1912, construction workers accidentally broke through a wall while building a new subway line and discovered it still sitting there on its tracks, exactly where it had been left, as if it were still waiting for passengers who never came. The official explanation says the system collapsed because of a stock market crash. But when you start looking closely, the timeline doesn't make sense. The sequence of events doesn't line up. And the deeper you dig, the stranger the story becomes. The man behind this forgotten subway was Alfred Ely Beach. If that name doesn't sound familiar, that's part of the mystery. Beach wasn't some obscure inventor working alone in a basement. He was one of the most respected figures in American engineering circles at the time. He owned and edited Scientific American, one of the most influential publications in the country. He was also a patent lawyer who handled thousands of inventions and innovations. Beach himself held several patents, including a typewriter designed for the blind that won a gold medal at the Crystal Palace Exposition in 1853. This was a well-connected, highly respected inventor with deep ties to the world of science and industry. And he had been thinking about underground transportation for decades. As early as 1849, Beach was writing about the idea of a subway system in the pages of his own magazine. He believed that cities would eventually need transportation systems beneath their streets. By the late 1860s, New York City desperately needed exactly that. At the time, around 700,000 people were packed into Lower Manhattan. The streets had become nearly impossible to navigate. Horse-drawn omnibuses crawled through traffic at little more than walking speed. Crossing Broadway could take half an hour. Horses collapsed in the streets from exhaustion and were sometimes left where they fell. The air was thick with dust and manure. Newspapers described the experience of traveling through Manhattan as physically miserable. One reporter wrote that a healthy person couldn't ride even a dozen blocks without developing a headache. Beach watched all of this from his office window overlooking City Hall. And he believed there was a better solution. In one of his articles, he described it simply: a tube, a passenger car, and a powerful revolving fan. That was all it would take. In 1867, he decided to prove it. At the American Institute Fair in New York, Beach built a working prototype. It was a wooden tube about 100 feet long and 6 feet in diameter. Inside it was a small passenger car, capable of carrying about 10 people. At one end of the tube sat a massive fan. When it spun forward, air pressure pushed the car down the tube. When the fan reversed direction, suction pulled the car back. The demonstration fascinated the public. People lined up to ride it. The system was clean, quiet, and surprisingly smooth. For many visitors, it felt like they were seeing a glimpse of the future. But Beach understood something critical. The people who controlled New York's transportation system had no interest in a better solution. They were making too much money from the system that already existed. In 1868, New York City was effectively controlled by a powerful political organization known as Tammany Hall. At its center was a man named William Tweed, better known as Boss Tweed. Tweed ran the city like a private business. His political network controlled contracts, infrastructure, and major public projects. Through inflated invoices, kickbacks, and outright theft, Tweed's circle siphoned enormous sums from city funds, possibly as much as $200 million. And transportation was one of the biggest sources of profit. Tweed had financial ties to the elevated railway companies that were beginning to appear in Manhattan. He also had connections to the horse-drawn streetcar lines that dominated travel across the city. An underground subway threatened all of those revenue streams. Beach knew that if he openly proposed building a subway beneath Broadway, Tweed's political machine would shut it down immediately. So he did something bold. He lied. Instead of applying for permission to build a subway, Beach applied for a permit to install pneumatic mail tubes beneath Broadway. Small tubes designed to carry letters and packages between buildings. The city approved the permit without hesitation. But what Beach built wasn't a mail tube. It was a subway. To build it, Beach quietly rented the basement of a clothing store called Devlin's, located at the corner of Broadway and Warren Street. The location couldn't have been more symbolic. It sat directly across the street from City Hall, right under the noses of the very politicians who would have stopped the project immediately if they had known what he was really doing. And then the digging began. For 58 nights, workers labored underground by lantern light. They excavated soil slowly and carefully, hauling the dirt away in carts under cover of darkness, so no one would suspect what was happening beneath the street. Each morning, the site looked ordinary again. Meanwhile, below the pavement of Broadway, a tunnel was taking shape. To accomplish this, Beach invented something entirely new: a hydraulic tunneling shield. It was the first circular tunneling design ever used in the United States. The machine allowed workers to safely carve a round passage through the earth while protecting them from collapse. By the time the work was finished, Beach had built a tunnel 312 feet long and 9 feet in diameter. The interior was lined with brick, forming a smooth cylindrical passage beneath the busiest street in New York. And he paid for it himself. The entire project cost about $350,000, roughly the equivalent of $8 million today. Think about that for a moment. What kind of system forces an inventor to hide his work from his own government? What kind of city makes innovation happen in secret, at night, with the evidence removed before dawn? Not a system built to serve the public. A system built to protect the profits of the people already benefiting from the problem. When everything was ready, Beach decided to reveal what he had done in the most dramatic way possible. On February 26, 1870, he opened the doors without warning. He invited politicians, journalists, and prominent citizens to come see what had been built beneath Broadway. The reaction was immediate shock. Newspapers across the city rushed to cover the story. One headline described it as a fashionable reception held in the bowels of the earth. Reporters descended into the underground station and found themselves staring at something that felt almost surreal. The waiting room alone stunned them. Its walls were decorated with frescoes and elegant artwork. Soft lighting illuminated the space. Plush seating allowed passengers to relax comfortably while waiting for the train. In the center of the room, a small fountain bubbled gently, with goldfish swimming in the water. And sitting in the corner was a grand piano. Gas lamps and special zircon lights filled the chamber with a soft white glow. The entire station had been designed to feel refined and welcoming, more like a luxurious parlor than a transportation hub. Then there was the train itself. The passenger car was cylindrical and carefully crafted, with upholstered seats for 22 passengers. It looked as elegant as a first-class railway carriage. And powering it all was something the engineers proudly called the Western Tornado. The machine weighed 48 tons. Built by the Roots Patent Force Blast Company, it was an enormous blower, driven by a 100-horsepower steam engine. Every minute, it pushed roughly 100,000 cubic feet of air into the tunnel. When the system activated, the rush of air propelled the passenger car smoothly down the tube. Once it reached the end, the operator reversed the airflow, creating suction that gently pulled the car back to the station. Passengers described the ride as almost magical. There was no smoke, no rattling, no violent jolts, just a quiet, steady glide through the underground tunnel, accompanied only by the soft sound of air moving around the car. People loved it. In the first 2 weeks alone, the system sold 11,000 rides. Within its first year, about 400,000 people had experienced the Underground Railway. Scientific American praised the invention enthusiastically. The magazine wrote that passengers would never again have to endure the choking dust of city streets once travel moved underground. The public didn't just enjoy the ride, they demanded more. New Yorkers wanted the system expanded across the entire city. For them, it seemed obvious. This was the future of transportation. But there was a problem. Beach couldn't legally charge fares or expand the system without an official franchise granted by the state legislature. Technically, everything he had built was classified as a demonstration. The money collected from riders didn't go into Beach's pocket. Instead, it was donated to a charity that supported the children of soldiers and sailors. If the subway was going to grow into a real transportation system, Beach needed permission from Albany. And that meant dealing with the political forces he had tried to avoid from the beginning. For 4 straight years, Beach fought to expand the subway. Each year, he lobbied the state legislature, pushing for approval to extend the pneumatic subway north through Manhattan. Twice, the proposal actually passed both houses of the legislature, and twice, it was vetoed by the governor. Governor John Hoffman rejected the bills in 1871 and again in 1872. Hoffman was closely tied to Boss Tweed's political machine. Officially, he claimed the subway legislation granted too much authority to a private company, without proper compensation for the city. But the real concern was something else: competition. Tweed and his allies had invested heavily in elevated railway lines that were being constructed above Manhattan's streets. An underground subway threatened to undermine those investments. At the same time, wealthy property owners along Broadway began filing lawsuits against the project. Some of the most powerful names in New York were involved, including John Jacob Astor and the merchant Alexander Stewart. Their argument was that tunneling beneath Broadway might damage the foundations of their buildings. The lawsuits dragged through the courts, slowing everything down, and the pattern became impossible to ignore. A technology that clearly worked, a public that wanted it, and a powerful establishment blocking it at every opportunity. Later, historians sometimes tried to soften the story, suggesting that Tweed himself might not have directly opposed Beach's subway. But the historical record tells a different story. Beach had built the tunnel in secret precisely because he knew Tammany Hall would never approve the permits. And when he tried to expand the system through legal channels, every path forward was obstructed by Tweed's political network or by people connected to it. This wasn't simple bureaucratic delay. It was systematic suppression. Then, unexpectedly, the situation changed. By late 1871, the entire Tweed empire began collapsing. The New York Times published secret financial records, revealing the enormous scale of corruption within Tweed's organization. Harper's Weekly ran devastating political cartoons that exposed the scandal to the public. Soon after, Boss Tweed was arrested. He was tried, convicted, and eventually imprisoned. In a bizarre twist, he later escaped to Spain before being captured again and returned to jail, where he ultimately died. With Tweed gone, the obstacle that had blocked Beach for years finally disappeared. At last, it seemed like the subway might have its chance. In 1873, everything finally seemed to turn in Alfred Beach's favor. A new governor, John Dix, had taken office. Unlike his predecessor, Dix was not tied to the old Tammany Hall power structure that had blocked the project again and again. When Beach's proposal reached his desk, the governor signed it. At last, after 4 exhausting years of lobbying and political battles, Beach had what he needed: full legal authorization to expand the pneumatic subway. The plan was ambitious. 5 miles of underground tube running from Battery Park all the way to Central Park. A clean, fast transportation system that would finally relieve the suffocating congestion on Manhattan's streets. For Beach, it must have felt like the end of a long war. But the victory didn't last long. Just 3 weeks after the bill was signed, the entire financial foundation of the project collapsed. On September 18, 1873, a major banking firm called J. Cook & Company declared bankruptcy. At the time, Cook's bank was deeply involved in financing railroad construction across the United States. When it failed, the shock rippled through the entire economy. The result was the Panic of 1873. It quickly became the worst financial crisis America had ever experienced up to that point. 89 railroads went bankrupt. 18,000 businesses failed. Unemployment eventually climbed to around 14%. Investors panicked. Credit dried up. Money disappeared almost overnight. And the people who had promised to finance Beach's subway expansion vanished with it. The timing raises uncomfortable questions. A working transportation technology had already been proven. Hundreds of thousands of people had ridden it. The public loved it. After years of political obstruction, the system finally received legal approval. And then it was destroyed by a financial collapse triggered by speculation in railroads, the very industry that had been threatened by Beach's invention. Under the terms of his charter, Beach had 6 months to secure funding for the expansion. But in the middle of the worst economic depression the country had ever seen, raising that kind of money was impossible. The pneumatic subway shut down. The tunnel beneath Broadway was sealed with brick, and Alfred Beach was left to watch the city he had tried to save continue choking on traffic for decades. The entrance to his underground station had been located in the basement of a building known as the Rogers Peat Building. In 1898, that building caught fire and burned down. Whatever remained of the elegant waiting room, the fountain, the piano, the decorations, was most likely destroyed in the flames. The tunnel itself remained buried and forgotten beneath Broadway. There was no plaque, no memorial, no marker telling anyone that the first working subway in America had once existed there. Beach died in 1896, just 2 years before the fire. When the New York Times published his obituary, it took up only a few inches of space on the page. The man who had built America's first subway. The man who had invented tunneling technology that engineers would continue using for generations. The man who proved underground transportation could work decades before the city finally built one. He faded almost completely from public memory. Then, in February of 1912, something unexpected happened. Workers digging a new line for the BMT Broadway subway accidentally broke through a brick wall underground. On the other side was Beach's tunnel. It had been sealed for 42 years. Inside, the air was dry and strangely warm. The tunnel had remained perfectly preserved, and sitting quietly on the tracks was the passenger car. It looked almost exactly as it had the day the system shut down, like it had simply been waiting for riders to return. At one end of the tunnel, workers even found the tunneling shield Beach had used during construction, still positioned as if the project might resume at any moment. According to reports at the time, the grand piano was still there as well. The workers took photographs. Engineers documented the discovery. The tunneling shield was removed and donated to Cornell University as an important piece of engineering history. Then the tunnel was destroyed. The remains of Beach's subway were demolished to make room for the new line. And somewhere along the way, Cornell lost track of the tunneling shield entirely. One of the most significant engineering artifacts in the history of American transit simply disappeared. The company that inherited Beach's rights later sued the city for destroying the property. The result of that lawsuit is unclear. There is no definitive record of how the case ended. And once you begin looking at the story as a whole, it becomes difficult to ignore the pattern. A working subway existed. It was sealed away for 4 decades. When it was rediscovered, the physical evidence was either destroyed or vanished. Corporate records faded from history. The technology itself quietly disappeared from the public narrative. Then, in 2013, Elon Musk introduced an idea called Hyperloop. Pods traveling through low-pressure tubes. Passengers propelled through tunnels by air pressure at incredible speeds between cities. The media described it as revolutionary, a futuristic transportation system unlike anything that had come before. But the basic concept sounded strangely familiar. A tube, a passenger car, a powerful fan pushing air through the system. Little more is required. Alfred Beach had written those exact words in 1870. 150 years later, the same idea was being presented again as a brand new innovation. Beach had already proven it could work. 400,000 people had experienced it firsthand. And yet, in many ways, we're still waiting for it today. The technology has never really been the problem. The problem is who controls the approvals, who profits from the systems that already exist, who decides which ideas are allowed to move forward and which ones quietly disappear. Today, trains run beneath Broadway through tunnels that were partly built where Beach once worked. Somewhere down there, pieces of his original tunnel are still embedded within the walls. There may even be a small section still accessible through a manhole on Reed Street, though few people seem interested in searching for it. At one point, a plaque was supposedly commissioned to honor Alfred Beach at the City Hall station. But no one seems certain where it actually is. Some historians believe it was never installed at all. What we know for certain is this. In 1870, Alfred Ely Beach built a functioning underground transit system. It worked. Hundreds of thousands of people rode it. The public loved it. Political corruption blocked its expansion for years. When the system was finally approved, the financial world collapsed and killed the project. The evidence was sealed away, forgotten, and later destroyed or lost. Which leaves us with a much harder question. Why did New York wait 34 more years to build a subway when one had already existed? Why is there no memorial at the site where American underground transit began? Why did Cornell lose the tunneling shield? And why are we still being promised pneumatic transit systems that were already proven to work before anyone alive today was even born? Alfred Beach spent the equivalent of millions of dollars from his own pocket to demonstrate that underground transportation was possible. He built his subway in secret because he knew the system would never allow it to be built openly. 400,000 people rode it. Then he watched it die. He watched the tunnel sealed shut. He watched the city continue suffering from the same traffic problems for another 34 years. He died in 1896. 2 years later, the station burned. 8 years after that, New York finally opened a subway and acted as if the idea had just been invented. When workers rediscovered Beach's car in 1912, it had been sitting patiently on its tracks for 42 years, waiting for passengers who never came. They photographed it. Then they destroyed it. The tunneling shield was sent to Cornell. Cornell lost it. The company that inherited Beach's rights sued the city. The outcome disappeared into the historical record. And somewhere beneath Broadway today, built into the structure of modern subway tunnels, lie the buried remains of America's first subway. No clear plaque, no memorial where it began, just the pattern. A technology that worked, a public that wanted it, an establishment that stopped it, and a city that waited 3 decades to build what one man had already created with his own money in 58 nights beneath their feet. The real question isn't whether this story happened. The real question is how many times it has happened since. What other technologies worked? What else was buried? What else might already exist somewhere, waiting, like that forgotten subway car, for a world that was never allowed to use it? The tunnel is gone, but the pattern remains, and once you see it, it's very hard to unsee it.